Welcome to Planet Geo, the podcast where we talk about our amazing planet, how it works, and why it matters to you. All right, let's do some introductions real quick. You are Chris Boyce, a nationally recognized and award-winning earth science teacher in the great state of Michigan. I am Dr. Jesse Reimink, a geoscience professor at Penn State and your former student. About 15 or 20 years ago, who's really counting anyways, I remember sitting in your class learning the basics of geoscience from you. And this is Planet Geo, a podcast where you and I talk about some amazing aspects of our planet, how it works, and why the geosciences are really important to society.
How you doing, Jesse?
Hey, I'm doing all right, man. How about you?
I am doing great. You bet.
Yeah, excited to be here.
Me too.
What's got you fired up this week, Chris?
Right now, I'm in the process of getting ready to head off to the Black Hills. I leave in just a few days. I'm going to the Black Hills for a couple of days to perform a wedding of a couple of my former students, which is really interesting because they want to do this on top of Little Devil's Tower, which is in Custer State Park, and they want to do it at sunrise. So we're going to we're going to begin hiking at 4 a.m. and get up to the top with about 30 people and get these two married off. So that'll be pretty cool.
So you're a preacher now, is that right? Or what
no,
kind of status do you have?
Quite. So it's pretty easy to get certified to perform marriages. So, yeah.
Oh, very cool. Well, I'm jealous you get to go to the Black Hills. That's one of my favorite spots.
And then
to go
after
visit.
that, then we head to Jenny and I, my wife, we're gonna head to the Tetons for about 2 weeks and just kind of do some backpacking and a little bit of climbing, and can't wait. Need to get in the mountains, fill my soul.
Awesome.
Yeah. So how about you? What's got you fired up, Jess?
Yeah, I'm. We just got a grant funded, or had a grant funded through the National Science Foundation. So I just got that news
deal.
A week or two ago. Yeah, I'm excited. I mean, it's a relatively small grant, and it's working on some instrumentation development that I've been doing the last couple of years. So I'm really excited to get started on it. But with the COVID restrictions in place, we're waiting to see when we're allowed to get back into the labs and start working in the labs.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's kind of a lead into what we're going to talk about today. As we're recording this, we are, kind of in the middle of the COVID, or let's see, we don't know what the future will hold.
That's for sure.
We're past the tail end of the COVID lockdowns, but there might be more on the horizon. We're not really sure. So it's a really uncertain time. Everybody's been affected in some way or another. I just consider myself lucky enough to be in a position, in a job that has been able to continue working remotely, and I've been able to be, fairly productive in it. How about you? How's COVID affected you so far?
It's certainly different. I'm a high school teacher, and so since March, middle of the March, I've been teaching from home. I've been doing online stuff, and I do my best. I try to make it still me and do my thing, but it's very difficult. I'm not a sit at a desk kind of teacher anyway. I need to be up and moving. So, like you said, I count myself extremely fortunate to be able to still do this though from home. You're not going to hear me complaining about my situation.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, there's been a fair bit of suffering silence, I think, for me of it sucks, but there's a lot of other people who it sucks a lot more for. So anyway, this week, we really want to focus on a couple of, let's say, silver linings from the geoscience perspective on this whole COVID lockdown. And I've learned a lot from investigating the things we're going to talk about today. And I don't know if you've done the same.
That's one of the things about this that I'm excited about doing these podcasts is that it forces me out of my comfort zone. This is certainly, as I was getting ready to talk to you about this, I learned a ton about things that I was maybe more ignorant on than, and so, this benefits me a lot having these discussions with you. So.
Yeah, it's super fun. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff that happened during this lockdown. So I guess as a brief summary, you're listening at home. If you're listening, a couple of years from now or several months from now, we're in the middle of these lockdowns. Economies are just starting to open up, but much of the developed world sort of went into this shutdown where people were staying at home, stay-at-home orders, businesses were shut down and affected, and a lot of interesting things happen. We're going to kind of summarize two aspects of the geosciences that from a kind of a data detection point of view of what happened when everybody stayed at home for a while. What happened to our planet when everybody stayed at home for a while? I think it's really interesting, and there's some positive things and some, at the very least, some information in this stuff for determining how we
Just
go
one thing
forward.
I'd like to add is, during this whole lockdown, it's amazing how long a tank of gas lasted, isn't it? I mean, you'd go, I went
right.
over a month without filling up my gas tank, which is crazy. As I was getting ready for this, I Googled, because I'd seen this before from like early April, just some photos, before and after photos of areas. Like, for instance, you can see in early April, Mount Everest became visible from Kathmandu for the first time in decades because of lower particulates, lower levels of pollution in the atmosphere. And you could,
Oh, is that right? So just the haziness kind of declined enough where you could see Everest from a lot farther away?
Unbelievable. And I'm sure some of you have seen for instance, Venice, how with less boat traffic in the canals, and how now the water has cleared and you can see down to the bottom of these canals. It's absolutely amazing. So.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, right, to see how nature sort of takes over the system. I remember seeing early on that when New York City locked down, you see these pictures of coyotes running through the streets and all this kind of stuff. Wildlife kind of taken back over. I saw the Venice photos on Twitter for the first time, and I also was turned on to the first topic we're going to talk about, which is seismic noise, via some seismologists on Twitter who were highlighting this kind of thing. So I think the first thing we're going to talk about is seismic noise. The Earth really quieted down because people weren't driving around. There weren't as many trains going, planes landing, big trucks rolling past, all this stuff. The Earth really quieted down, which is really interesting. So let's start out. I mean, seismometers, what is a seismometer,
All right.
Chris?
So this is a device that measures vibrations on the surface of the Earth and traveling through the Earth itself. It's amazing how sophisticated they are and how little the motion has to be in order for it to even pick this up. But that's what a seismometer is.
Yeah.
We've been using these. This is what we use to assess earthquakes and so on. People often think about what a seismometer is in relation to earthquakes, but in fact, we're talking about seismometers that are detecting anthropogenic human background noise from, like you said, trucks and trains and cars and planes and things like this.
Yeah, so I think the seismometers you can think of it basically as this pendulum suspended in the air, where if the Earth moves under it, I mean, they really used to be just a vertically hanging thread with like a pencil attached to it. And if the Earth moved under that pencil, the pencil would draw a line on the chart, right? That was sort of the very
right. It was on a
simplistic
drum,
idea.
and the drum turned, by a clock, and so it recorded exactly when the vibrations took place, and then of course because of the amount that the device moved, the pen would draw on that drum and show exactly how much the ground moved.
Exactly. So you can just imagine this piece of paper that's sitting on the ground with a hanging pencil above it. If you shift the ground beneath it, it's going to scratch out a movement, and the amount of movement is recorded on that scale. Nowadays, the seismometers are much more precise, and I'm just looking at the scale of the first article we're going to talk about. And I should mention, we're going to link all these articles in the podcast description so that you can go and look at them. But the scale here, we're looking at nanometers of ground displacement is what they're recording, which is amazing. I mean, nanometer is a billionth of a meter. And so this is a really tiny amount of movement that they're recording.
So Jesse, can you talk about then, how we would use seismographs for monitoring buildings and things along that line? Like, you did your postdoc at Carnegie. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, that's right. Carnegie is this research institute in Northwest Washington, D.C., and it was originally built kind of outside of the city to get away from the electric tram noise because they had these really sensitive magnetic field detectors. So it was built outside of the city, in the 1930s, which now the city has engulfed it. So it's kind of a noisy urban or suburban environment around there. But we still have, at Carnegie, we still had really sensitive instruments. A lot of the mass spectrometers are sensitive to this nanometer scale ground movement. So it's kind of a funny story. There was this sort of retirement home that was being renovated right next door to Carnegie, and they were doing a whole bunch of construction, building big new buildings, and so the architects, had to get approval. They had to, sign a contract and say we will create less than some X amount of ground disturbance. So the Carnegie seismologists who are on staff, they placed these seismometers around the campus and were, actively detecting the ground movement due to this construction site, which was, a quarter mile away. And actually, there was a couple times where they tripped, they went over the limit. So, they went in and said, "Hey, you went over the contractual limit. You need to stop making that noise."
That's
right?
awesome.
Yeah, I'm sure the guy, the boss of the construction site was like, "Oh, for goodness sakes, these stupid scientists, right? Like, they're just moving the ground a little bit. Are you freaking kidding me? What the hell's going on, right?"
Great.
Must have been extremely frustrating from his position, but it disturbed the instruments. So, anyways, it's kind of a funny story about how these seismometers.
I read an
can be
article on
used.
MLive about Michigan's football stadium and how they have these seismometers there, and they can actually, they're sensitive enough to pick up when there's a touch. They're sensitive enough to pick. That's unbelievable.
That's awesome. I think there's an article maybe last year about Penn State too. Some enterprising young grad student had gone and placed the seismometer, near the football stadium or something like that. And it's impressive. You can watch during the game. You can see when touchdowns happen. You can see when kickoff happened because everybody's making a lot of noise and stomping their feet or whatever. So they're incredibly sensitive instruments. And I think this Michigan seismometer was one that was tracking the quieting of the earth.
I came across
another
another article, and I can't remember what it is, Jesse, but my takeaway was that the quieting from COVID, although it lasted longer, is comparable to what we see on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day.
That's really interesting. Just because everybody's at home and sort of hanging out with their family. That's really interesting.
All right, Jesse, let's transition then. How's this important? Why is this?
Yeah, so I guess, the data, we're looking at this graph. We'll link the article in the podcast description. But basically, you're looking at this seismic noise, or basically the vibration of these seismometers as a function of time. And at background, it's really interesting because you can see weekends in this data chart. So this is a seismometer sitting, at Michigan Stadium in Ann Arbor, and it's recording ground movement, just background ground movement. So it records earthquakes when they come in. It records any movement, trucks passing by, stuff like that. And there's a little bit of background noise. And I'm looking at the chart right now, and on a typical weekday, it's something like 50 or 60 nanometers of movement. And the weekend, it kind of drops down to something like 40 maybe. So it's kind of interesting. You can see the weekends in there because people aren't driving around, presumably, right? Or walking around campus or something like that. And then during COVID lockdowns, as soon as the lockdowns hit, the weekday noise level dropped down to below 40 nanometers of ground displacement. So it basically dropped by a third on this.
That's amazing. We're kind of talking about bright spots. So how can something like that benefit these professionals? What's the bright spot here?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think it means that these seismometers, as they're really sensitive instruments, but the background noise is kind of like static in a radio. So if you have a lot of static coming through your radio, you can't hear any noises, any actual speaking or music or whatever is coming through your radio. You can't hear that above the static. If you lower the static, you can start to hear softer and softer noises. You can hear whispers if you lower the static. So these seismic waves, it's a shock wave basically, and it gets deflected by different boundaries and different layers. And it's extremely important for hydrocarbon industry, for looking underneath of sediments, looking underneath the earth for where oil and gas might be trapped. Where should we put these drills? It costs many millions of dollars to drill a hole in the ground. So having information about the subsurface is really a seismic question. So also helps inform, where the ground is moving. We talked about Yellowstone and the volcano breathing in and out. A lot of that is recorded in very small earthquakes. So we can see those much better if this
that makes
background
sense.
noise
It's
is
kind of
lower.
like if you're having a conversation, but you want to eavesdrop on another conversation, you shush the people around you so that you can hear what's going on.
That's a perfect analogy. That's a perfect analogy.
Okay, that's really cool.
Yeah, but these are surface seismometers, right? These are seismometers sitting on the surface, so they're kind of perhaps more sensitive to trucks driving by. Than if they were deeper down.
And we have those, right? We have deeper bored seismometers that are, I guess, maybe immune to what's going on at the surface to a much greater extent. I think I'd have a hard time if that was my line of work, not being distracted and just want to put seismometers in certain areas and play around with it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I would totally be the person putting it in the
right.
football stadium or putting it, outside and stomping around it, doing all that kind of stuff,
All right, Jesse. So that's really amazing about seismometers and so on and the bright spot with that. Let's touch on the air pollution reduction caused by the COVID stay-at-home orders and lockdowns. Particularly carbon dioxide, right?
Yeah, I think there's a couple interesting studies that we kind of explored here, and again, we'll link them in the notes. But one was on CO2 reduction, and another one we sort of highlighted the other air pollution reduction. And I think there's a couple really interesting aspects to this. I'm no expert on. I don't study climate change. I'm no expert on it. So this was very much.
I agree. As I was reading through these articles, it caused me then to look for other articles to explain things that I didn't quite understand in the original articles that we read to get ready for this podcast.
That's right. Oh, yeah. There's a lot I didn't understand. I mean, it took a little while to learn about this.
I just want to mention it. Well, I already kind of alluded to it when I said that you can see Everest from Kathmandu for the first time in decades, and that's smog and particulate matter in the atmosphere. And one of the things that I came across is that, we're seeing a reduction in nitrogen oxides. And at first I was confused by that. I had to think about nitrogen oxides. Well, why is that a byproduct of driving your car? So I had to, that's one of the things I looked into then is how, during combustion, you have oxygen and nitrogen that are present because those are the two most abundant gases in the atmosphere, and how at high temperatures there's a chemical reaction that creates these nitrogen oxide compounds. And that's a greenhouse gas. They're greenhouse gases, and they also are very closely associated with particulate matters, which in other words, smog, right? And so we've seen a reduction actually in these nitrogen oxide compounds due to COVID, due to the lockdowns and less travel. But we've seen an increase in the rise in ozone. Now, that's unbelievable. And that's because, so I had to look into why is that? Well,
yeah. That doesn't seem to make sense, right? I mean, ozone is, something we're putting into the atmosphere, and we're trying to reduce or we're trying to keep the ozone layer intact and all this kind of stuff. So why is that happening? Why this?
Well, so we're talking, it's a good point. We're talking about ozone in the lower atmosphere. It's called the troposphere. And we don't want that. We want ozone in the next layer up in the atmosphere, 20 to 50 miles up in a layer called the stratosphere. That's good ozone. We don't want it down here. It's an irritant. It's a greenhouse gas. It affects people that have respiratory issues greater and so on. So we don't want this ozone. But these nitrogen compounds in the presence of sunlight and higher temperatures, so warmer days, it breaks down the ozone. And so with less nitrogen oxide compounds, there's been an increase then in ozone.
Oh, wow. That's crazy. So these unintended consequences of actually decreasing a pollutant increases another pollutant.
Yeah. It is.
That's really interesting. I think, so we're talking about a Science Daily article here that referred to 2 papers in the journal Geophysical Research Letters that just came out during COVID that are talking about this air quality response and highlighting
Can you talk a little bit about then some of the numbers? Because I think the article you're referring to deals primarily with carbon dioxide emissions.
Yeah, that's right. So we also were turned on to a paper by Leclerc et al. in Nature Climate Change that just came out. And again, we'll link this in the podcast description. But this is really looking at global CO2 emissions during the COVID confinement or during the COVID lockdowns. So they came up with a way to kind of track global CO2 emissions, which is a complicated thing in and of itself. And not something we're particularly good at, although we know it's rising pretty substantially year to year on a year by year basis. So they're looking at daily CO2 emissions. So comparing, how much CO2 is emitted per day, comparing it to the same time last year. And basically what they're seeing is that globally, on average, the CO2 emissions drop by like 17% or 20% per day during the lockdown. So everybody stay home, nobody drive around, nobody go to work, everybody just stay in your house, drop by 17%, which I guess it kind of struck me as less.
I was going to say the exact same thing. Because I think about how long a tank of gas lasted me, and everybody else had to be in the same boat, right? I was emitting a lot less just from transportation, but maybe that's the thing too, right? You get a lot of carbon dioxide emissions. We used more electricity, I would assume, right? Because we're staying at home.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they broke this down in the paper, CO2 emissions by industry, by sector, and power production kind of stayed basically the same. It increased in some areas. And what also increased is residential CO2 emissions. So people were just staying home, burning more electricity, running AC, running the power, heat, whatever. That sector was sort of emitted more CO2 during the lockdowns, kind of as you would expect. What really decreased is the surface transport, driving your cars around, and actually airplanes. So airplanes flying around, that dropped dramatically. So that really was driving.
It dropped by about 17%, but it's important to note, I think, that is through early April. Okay, that's really in the height of the lockdown. Right. So they also went on then, and now they can't predict the future really, but that everything is starting to open back up, and we don't know what's going to happen. Nobody knows this, but they're on the low end. They think that this COVID shutdown will result over the course of the year 2020, maybe a 4% decrease in carbon dioxide emissions, and on the high end, up to maybe 7% decrease in carbon dioxide emissions. Okay, so.
Yeah, so let's break that number down a bit. I mean, the 17% number is a daily reduction. So every day, 17% decrease over the same day last year. But if you did that every day for the whole year, you'd have a 17% decrease for the year. But the uncertainty comes in predicting that into the future. If COVID lockdowns stay in place, if they're released, if people start moving around, then you're going to see a return back to daily CO2 emissions that are kind of higher, which means that for the year, you're not getting that 17%.
It's really interesting, and a 4 to 7% drop. Okay, that puts us back to the levels that we were emitting in 2006. That's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean,
so it's amazing. Yeah, we're winding back the clock. 10
but
years
to me, I look
like
at that and I say, that means that we've had a lot of increased carbon dioxide emissions in the last 14 years. Then, if this lockdown puts us back to 2006 levels. Yeah,
I mean, 2006, we both remember 2006. And I mean, you were, 80 in 2006 or something like that? Yeah. I think it's interesting, and also put it in the context of sort of global climate change and what the sort of recommendations are, is that, we're looking at, the recommendations vary, but we're looking at something like 6 to 7% decrease every year going forward is what we need to sort of stem things like ocean rise, sea level rise, and things like that. And so this 4 to 7% decrease due to a month or two of COVID lockdowns is basically, we need to implement the high end of that globally going forward. So we either need to lock down our economies for a month or two every year.
Nobody is advocating.
Or figure out a more... No, absolutely not, right? Absolutely not. Or we need to provide some structural changes to the energy sector, provide power with these other means, these more sort of CO2 friendly means, which either way you look at it, it's an interesting statistic, and it hopefully will help guide how we
this
move
is kind
forward.
Of like an unintended experiment, right? What we're going through with COVID. But it provides us, though, with a glimpse into the possibilities of emission regulations. That's, I think, what you're talking about.
And so let's put this kind of on a personal level, Chris. What what do you take home, for your daily life from either the CO2 thing, seismometer thing? What are you going to think about more as you walk around the world after reading these articles?
This definitely puts me on the spot, but I think my first takeaway is that I've got more to learn, and I'm excited about that. I always love that. And I was also just excited about, or interested, I guess, is maybe a better way of saying it, that this 2-month, lockdown resulted in a reduction in emissions that can have a real impact if it's sustained. I don't, 4 to 7%. I guess I don't know. I don't know how difficult that is to get to. I mean, obviously, then you start thinking about, all right, how can that happen? We have growing populations and so on. How do you get to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 7%? But then you start talking about, renewable forms of energy and supplementing our use of fossil fuels with that, and maybe we can get there that way. I don't know. What do you think? What's your takeaway?
Like you, I did kind of a deep dive, except I took a deep dive into the seismometer aspect of this and sort of the earth quieting down. But I really did a close look at, all the information we gather from these really sensitive seismometers and how important it is for hydrocarbon studies and hydrocarbon extraction and understanding. The Defense Department uses these seismometers to detect nuclear testing around the world, and using these really sensitive things. It's super interesting. I thought that was a really, really good take-home conclusion. But I agree with you completely that the understanding of the emissions reductions and how power is generated, how CO2 is produced in our culture, in our society, that's something I think is really a good take-home.
I want to just add one other thing, just a kind of a personal thought and an observation on my part. When you hike up to the top of Blacktail Butte, overlooking the Grand Tetons, every morning now, there is a layer.
What a stunning view, first of all. That is like one of the most powerful things, thinking about the we got to talk about the Tetons at some point. They're unbelievable. Most spectacular mountain range. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you.
Just that every morning you can see smog in the valley.
Really?
And it wasn't there 15 years ago, but it is now, and it's there all the time. And it lifts during the course of the day, but it's there every morning. That bothers me every time I see it. And so this is something that I feel strongly about, because I don't like it,
Absolutely. So. Absolutely. And, although I think it's really interesting, the unpredictability of the future, we can't really predict it, but I think we have some understanding of how we can at least try and do better. Right.
Right on.
So anyways, those are kind of my take home point from a personal perspective. And I think, mainly I thought that in this really stressful time, there's some interesting aspects to what happened. And there's some interesting geoscience implications for the whole world being locked down basically for a little bit. It was really interesting. I thought it had some positive things.
Yep, I agree. I enjoyed it.
That's it for this week. As usual, if you enjoyed what you heard, please give us a subscribe, a like, maybe a review even, and pass us along to anybody you think might enjoy the geosciences and learning a little bit more. We are at Planet Geocast on all the social medias, and if you feel like sending us an email, we are planetgeocast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.